The Digibridge lecture series is sponsored by a bridge grant from South Carolina Humanities. Funding for the bridge grants has been provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities Act. We are indeed grateful for the stalwart support of SC Humanities, particularly Executive Director Randy Akers and Assistant Director TJ Wallace. This generous grant has enabled us to engage independent scholars who are very knowledgeable about Georgetown County's special local heritage. The scheduled presenters we have coming up for you include a host of respected names who will speak to a rich range of subjects, including our area's Gullah heritage, maritime and agricultural histories, Ghostlore, and several notable African-American voices. And today we have our lead-off specialist with us, Elizabeth Huntinsger. She is the author of 3 popular collections of ghost stories and legends based right here in Georgetown County: Ghost of Georgetown, More Ghost of Georgetown, and Georgetown Mysteries and Legends. She believes Georgetown to be one of the most haunted locales in the South, which is saying something. We have more than 100 reported spectral sightings here. Elizabeth is a storyteller, historic reenactor, and living historian who unburies the history in these ghost stories. In her ghost lore, we find out what these ghosts can tell us about our past and also our present, what still frightens us as a culture and why. She is a South Carolina native whose family roots here stretch back to the 1600s. And she also leads the Ghost of Georgetown Lantern Tours. So here, please welcome Elizabeth Huntinsger, Georgetown Historic Ghost Lore. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah.
Georgetown became an international port of entry in 1735, and that's pretty much about the time where her ghostly history began. When Thomas Bolum had begun a waterfront tavern in 1734, even before the township was laid out, many cups were turned up. Georgetown was a wild and lawless place. Pirates roamed her streets. Many of the folk in Thomas Bolum's tavern would have supped through glass-bottom cups so they could see who was coming when they turned their cup up. Plus, they wanted to make sure there wasn't a crown popped in their drink so that they would be shanghaied into a pirate crew against their will. Many enslaved Africans had been brought to Georgetown by this time, and they brought with them many, many things. Of course, not able to carry anything on their persons. What they brought was knowledge. One of those was the making of the sweetgrass baskets and many other things, which we'll explore in just a little while. Thomas Bolum and his waterfront tavern are gone now, but the house still remains. As a matter of fact, folks who visit here can stay there, and who knows what they see. A lady who restored the house and lived there throughout her life had begun living there around 1938 as in a rental with her family, and in the 1970s she and her husband bought the house and began restoring it. Her husband dug up the cistern in the backyard and discovered more bottles than any colonial family would have ever thrown away or buried in their premises. This is when they realized and did research, finding out this had been Thomas Bolum's Waterfront Tavern. And this explained what had happened at their Christmas tree trimming party the first year of their ownership of this home. One of the guests had gone into the back of the house, which was the kitchen. They called it the shed room, but it was their kitchen. And this is where they had the array of alcohol for the Christmas party, the tree trimming party set up. This was unusual for this house. And one of the guests was back there making himself a libation when he saw what appeared to be an elderly, very wrinkled man in an old-fashioned sailor outfit. And he was hovering around the array of alcohol. Plus, he was looking a little bit disoriented and wandering around. And the guest made a point of asking his hosts about this later. they had never seen this man before. No one they knew fit this description. And the guest, when we were rating this, he said the fellow looked, at closer look, more weathered than he did ancient, like he'd been at sea for a long time. He was one of the habitués of Thomas Bolum's Waterfront Tavern that had come back, drawn by the libations that he had enjoyed there so many years before. While this house, the lady who lived in there her lifetime told me constantly had ghosts, they never saw this fellow again. Sometimes a ghost makes one appearance. Sometimes the appearance happens over and over again, which is the case with another house in Georgetown, just a few blocks away. This house was called the Henning House, and the houses in Georgetown, you must know, they usually have two names. One is the present owner, that's the second name. The first name is that of the earliest recorded owner, and Henning was the earliest recorded owner of this house. Whether he was the person who built it, we're not certain. The first owner was a British sympathizer who allowed British soldiers to quarter in his home. Patriots usually had to evacuate their homes in what's now the historic district, but Tories, they could remain in their home and host British officers or soldiers in the comfort of their home. And this is what this fellow did. He didn't know his daughter was a patriot, a staunch patriot, and she was writing down everything that she heard these British soldiers say in the comfort of what they thought was a British residence. And she was passing this on to Francis Marion the Swamp Fox and Marion's men of Winyaw. She was doing this by climbing over the back garden wall of their home and into the Prince George churchyard, where she went to certain stones and left the messages there. Marion's men of Winyaw found the messages, found out what the British soldiers in that home were doing, and acted accordingly. None of the British soldiers' plans went as they had hoped. One British soldier, he was just getting out of the swamps and trying to get his muddy clothing off when he heard the alarm that the Patriots were in Georgetown and had to rush back down the stairs, and in trying to adjust his clothing, he tripped on an uneven stair step near the top of the flight. He tumbled down and broke his neck. That's not the end of his story, though. Anytime anyone is tripped on this same uneven riser, they haven't fallen to their death. Even if they've been in mid-tumble, they've been caught by a very strong but very gentle hand that sets them back upright. It's the ghost of the British soldier. This particular merchant, like many of the wealthy in Georgetown back in colonial days, had a country house as well as this townhouse where the British soldier still lives. His country home was named Wedgefield, and this was where British soldiers were holding one of Marion's men of Winyaw. He was actually the father of one of Francis Marion's men, and they feared that he might let go some secrets if he were pressed. And it was imperative to get this fellow out of the British hands. So the young lady of the house where the British soldier met his death, everyone thinking that she was a Tory, she contacted some Tory ladies, English sympathizers, at nearby Mansfield Plantation, and organized a soiree, a small get-together for some of the British soldiers, and this took all of those who were guarding this fellow away from Wedgefield, leaving one British sentinel guarding this elderly man. Well, this went as planned. Marion's men of Winyaw galloped down the Wedgefield Road, accosted this fellow, but it backfired. The fellow, the British soldier, drew a pistol, and before anyone could think twice, one of the patriots had whacked off his head. This is not something that was planned. It was something that was deeply regretted, but it was done. The British soldier staggered around headless for several moments, according to legend, until he fell down lifeless. But Marion's men of Winyaw left with their fellow they'd gotten back, and this fellow, the British one, has been left to wander around Wedgefield headless, where he's been seen many, many times in the moonlit looking for his lost head. Now, another ghost of Georgetown, of right in the historic district, is Theodosia Burr Alston. At age 29, she took a journey from which She never returned. In 1812, she was leaving on a trip to visit her father, Aaron Burr, in New York. She had been suffering from her health. Her young son had died of malaria the summer before. Her husband was the governor of South Carolina, the youngest governor the state had ever had. Theodosia was a famous person, and her father and her husband worried for her safety. This was the end of the War of 1812, or towards that, and they worried about her being accosted at sea. They hired her a passage on the ship Patriot, which was a heavily armed ship, a safe passage for somebody of Theodosia's stature to travel on. Well, Theodosia came to Georgetown the night before leaving, December 29th of 1812. She stayed at the house, which has a red roof, right by the International Port of Entry, which we mentioned was 1732. This was a very famous port area, and was where she left from. She boarded the Patriot before dawn on December 30th. She'd spent the night in Georgetown to do this, and she was never seen or heard from again. Aaron Burr, her father, was documented in the next weeks, standing on the docks in New York, scanning for the sails of the Patriot. Letters flew between him and her husband, Joseph Alston, down here. Theodosia was never seen or heard from again. Young Joseph Alston, 3 years later, no longer the governor, he passed away, some believe, of a broken heart, not knowing what happened to his beloved wife. She was only 29 when she disappeared, so it was many years before people of her generation were dying peaceful deaths on their beds. And there were 2 pirates of her, about her age, what her age would have been, that claimed they were responsible for Theodosia's disappearance and demise. But their documented confessions don't match. Plus, there had been numerous sightings of Theodosia on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. The stories are many. Her disappearance is one of the mysteries of Georgetown that has never been solved. But on cold December mornings before dawn, her form can still be seen walking down to the dock, where she took her last known footsteps on dry land. Now, Theodosia is not the only ghost we have here in the township. There are many others, but we're going to head out into the country. We're going to head out to the South Santee River, to Hopsawee Plantation. This is where Thomas Lynch, the youngest signer of the Declaration, lived. Now, his father, the senior Lynch, had been scheduled to sign the Declaration. He had headed up to Philadelphia to sign this and then been struck down. We know now that what happened to him was a stroke. Young Thomas Lynch, who was serving in the Continental Army, asked Christopher Gadsden, I believe, who was over him, if he could have permission to leave. It wasn't granted. So Thomas Lynch Sr. was made a delegate as well, and he went up and signed the Declaration. His father wasn't able to. They began to travel back down south, and Thomas Lynch Sr. died in Annapolis, Maryland in December. He was buried there. He had asked in his will, he had mentioned to people he knew during his lifetime that he wanted to lie near the South Santee River. But this was during wartime. The graves of patriots were often desecrated. Bringing his body back down south at this time would have probably been difficult and perhaps not possible. So he was buried in Annapolis. His son, young Thomas Lynch, the only one of their family who would have been able to bring the father back down, he contracted malaria when he was in the Continental Army. And he, as the war progressed and ended, he was suffering in health, and he took a sea trip with his wife at the doctor's orders for a change of scenery, not scenery, but a change of atmosphere. It was St. Eustatius they were heading for his health cure, and their ship was lost, and Thomas Lynch Sr. still rests in Annapolis. But a man in colonial clothing has been seen with a candle lantern walking on old roads that at that time belonged to Hopsawee. Every time he's seen, he's always headed toward the house. Many people believe that he is Thomas Lynch Sr., wanting to come back to where he'd wanted to be buried. One of the owners of the house, Regine Beatty, told me at one time that there was a film being done there, and it was the American Revolution from the British perspective. And she said that two ladies who were actors in this film, they changed their costumes or their historic clothing in the very bedroom that had been Thomas Lynch Sr.'s. And of course, their clothing was historically accurate. And they laughed and chortled over how the ladies must have looked in these clothings. And the part they were laughing about was the stays right here. And when the film came out, everything was perfect except for the area of the stays, which looked like a breeze was blowing through it. Was Thomas Lynch Sr., was he perhaps indignant that these ladies were making fun in his home where he slept? We'll never know. Hopsawee grew indigo in the early years before the Revolution. Of course, after the Revolution, Britain who was the biggest buyer of indigo, they didn't want to buy anything from us anymore, so rice became the main crop. Carolina gold rice was the one grown here. But indigo, which had made Carolina wealthy in the years before the Revolutionary War, it was brought into South Carolina by Eliza Lucas Pinckney. Eliza Lucas Pinckney was given seeds by her father, who was the governor of Antigua. She persevered with these seeds, and those who grow indigo now can tell you that the ways of making indigo grow are many, nicking the seeds, all sorts of ways of germinating them. Eliza persevered, and she eventually was able to grow indigo successfully. A little plant like this would have been her beginnings, and the grown plant would have been her joy. She would have had fields of these. Once she had indigo growing successfully, she gave seeds to many of the planters of the Lowcountry. She didn't sell them, she gave them. She wanted Carolina to prosper, and it did. Britain spent millions buying indigo from Carolina, and they did this up until the Revolution, when, of course, rice took over. Hampton Plantation, across the Santee Delta from where Hopsawee is, was the last home of Eliza Lucas Pinckney. Her plantations, her townhomes in Charleston had been burned during the Revolution, but her daughter had married into Hampton, and this is where Eliza spent her last years. She and her daughter Harriet and Harriet's daughter Harriet, the three of them hosted George Washington in 1791 on his first tour of the southern states. Years later, when the youngest Harriet had children, 8 children in all, and they were marrying, one of the children, the youngest boy, became the ghost of Hampton Plantation. Young John Henry, the youngest boy, had seen the illustrious marriages of many of his older brothers and sisters, but he didn't follow suit. He chose the daughter of the pharmacist in Georgetown as his wife. He never got to marry her because his mother Harriet and his grandmother Harriet, both widows now, both running Hampton and both in charge of everything he did, they told him no. Well, not to be outdone, John Henry rode into Georgetown, and he asked the pharmacist for his daughter's hand. The pharmacist, knowing everything about this, said this would not be a good life for his daughter, and he turned John Henry down. Poor John Henry, 21 years old, rode back to Hampton. He was inconsolable. According to family lore, he rocked in his chair for days, hours at a time. The stories of how his life ended are many. Some folks say he was in his room. Some folks say he was at the area where the stairs come together. Some say it was even at a party which had been put on by his mother and grandmother so he could meet more eligible young ladies. But whatever happened, John Henry did take his life right there in his home, but he didn't die for about 3 days. He was taken back up to his room. Wherever his what happened causing his demise occurred, he died in his room. and he spoke with his mother and his grandmother during his last days. He was lucid. They were able to talk to him, but they couldn't bury him in a churchyard. Even though he'd made his peace with his maker and his family, he was laid to rest between the house and the creek, of course, where his stone is today. And many people go and visit John Henry's stone. It tells of his magnanimity in the throes of a painful death. And John Henry has been said ever since to haunt Hampton Plantation. Now, another haunting of Georgetown takes place on the other side of Georgetown County, not the North and South Santee River where many planters lived, but in Plantersville, western Georgetown County, where there was also a group of rice planters living. Now, one of the many plantations there was called Asylum. Asylum was run by a gentleman who, Mr. McDowell, who had many enslaved Africans working there. 4 of them are documented as coming directly from Africa, and one of them was named Manza. He was one of the most treasured drivers, and when we say driver, this is not driving a horse, this is driving all the workers. He was given a great deal of responsibility, and when the owner, Mr. McDowell, when he kept a journal, and when he documented that he had what was called a terrible fever, he gave Manza full charge of the plantation. There was no overseer at that time. Manza was the only one there. During this time, there was an elderly enslaved woman who still worked in the fields, and one day she came in late for her meal. The reason was that her kerchief had been lost out in the field, and she didn't want to wait till the next day. This was a precious item of hers, and she went and retrieved it, and when she came back in, she saw that the meal was finished. But she did see that what was left had been put into a great cauldron, and she felt like maybe, even though she knew she wasn't supposed to, that she could scoop some of this out and put it in her bowl and eat it. It was sitting on the ground, and when she went to it to get her food, she was so thankful that she was going to have something to eat tonight, even though she'd been late for supper, until she saw a pair of boots come up, and the cauldron was knocked over, and everything that she would have had for supper, which was not that much that was left, was gone to her. Of course, she might have picked some fruit from a nearby tree, but on an empty stomach, that wasn't a good idea. She was distraught. She felt like if the owner had been there, this would not have happened. And then she thought, maybe there should be a different owner. And she said, this place is going to not be owned by any person for very long. This place is going to change hands and change hands and change hands. And her decree came about. After 9 years, it was sold. And Asylum Plantation was sold again and again and again and again. Enslaved people there would often see this lady, for she perished some years after this incident, and they wouldn't be frightened of her. Sometimes she would touch them during the night, but they knew she was just looking to make sure they were getting enough to eat. Her ghost was seen over and over up until 1945, when the last time the house was sold happened. And by this time it was named Exchange, and her ghost hasn't been seen ever since. Now, another ghost in Georgetown is that of the Crab Boy. We haven't mentioned any of the ghosts of the waterfront yet. This took place in Murrells Inlet. There was a young boy, an African-American he was, and this was one of the later stories, up in the late 1800s or early 1900s. And what he would do on most days was to go down to the shore on low tide and put his hand down in the holes of the stone crab and pull them out. Now, this is a very, very, very delicate thing to do. Most people would not dare put their hand in the hole of a stone crab, but this little boy had a knack for flipping the stone crab out when he was asleep. But one day his luck ran out, and the stone crab grabbed his little finger, his tiny finger on his tiny hand, and it wouldn't let go. Now, if any of you have ever seen a stone crab holding on to something, you would know why this little boy was in mortal terror. He screamed. Nobody could hear him. The tide was rising. It rose until his screams were no more, and he perished. And to this day, his cries can still be heard down on the creek bank in Murrells Inlet. He is the ghost of the crab boy. Now, we mentioned we were going to speak about some superstitions and some things that were brought over with enslaved Africans. One of these is that of the chicken's foot. Now, in many of the enslaved villages on these old plantations, there would be one lady who was the conjure woman. She would be the lady who could soothe people with the chicken's foot and calm their fears and stresses. Another superstition brought over is that of china berries. Now, if you go out in the country around Georgetown, a lot of times around some of the old fields, be they rice fields or some in the western part of the county, fields that grew other things that didn't require water like rice did, you'll see a ring of china berry trees. Now, the china berry bead, the china berry seed, is the same thing. The seed has a natural hole in it, and it can be strung. African ladies would string these and hang them around the necks of teething babies, and it was said, cause them not to feel any more teething pain. These are dyed beautiful different colors and are still sold in Georgetown today. Now, back on Old Hampton Plantation, there was said to have been a conjure lady named Tallulah, and this is documented. A lady named Miss Sue Alston, whose parents were enslaved people, wrote the story of John Henry that we covered just a little while ago, or she actually narrated it to an author. And she said that during John Henry's lifetime, he had taken his grandmother with her sick cat to Tallulah. Do you know what was wrong with the cat? The cat had swallowed a snake. The tail of the snake was hanging out the cat's mouth. We don't know what Miss Tallulah did to the snake. She didn't tell them, but she told them the cat would be all right, and it was. There are a great many mysteries in Georgetown, and we don't always have the answers any more than John Henry and his grandmother had the answer to how Miss Tallulah healed the cat. But that is the close of our ghost stories for today, and I do hope there'll be some questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Elizabeth.
It was my pleasure,
that
Daniel. Thank you.
Wonderful, and just a rich range of different stories out there, and it shows you not just, I guess, how haunted we are here, but just the rich range and depth of history that we have.
Indeed.
So that's amazing, all the centuries that pile up here. Yeah, so, and we do, each time when we have one of these live presentations, we will take some Q&A from our viewers out there, our audience members, so if you can feel free to comment and write in, and we'll ask our presenters here for those. So one question for you, Elizabeth Huntinsger, again. How did you get interested in these ghost stories?
That is a very good question. My mother would tell me ghost stories when I was a child, but they always had, she didn't want to scare me, so they always had an explanation. It was a cow and the moonlight was shining on it. The reason she told me these benevolent ghost stories was because her grandmother had told her and her 11 brothers and sisters terrifying ghost stories. And she didn't want me to be terrified in that manner.
Okay. So yeah, and some of these are kind of that you told are sort of mixed. I mean, some are, I guess, have happier endings or good endings.
Oh,
but
yes.
some definitely are, get the hackles up.
Oh, yes.
And yeah, so you've learned to cross over to the other side, I guess.
Oh, indeed. We temper some of the old terrifying stories.
Yeah. And I guess they serve as cautionary tales, maybe. If
yes. Cautionary tales, indeed they are.
So they can be good in that way, even if they do scare us. But it's interesting. And we do have some thunder going on outside.
Oh, yes. It was very atmospheric.
That is. We have, I should say, thank you to Truman Wins and Heather Pelham, our wonderful part of our Georgetown County Library System staff here who are working here. And they do great work in filming and producing these, but they're not putting on these sound effects. There really is thunder out here outside, which is perfect to give kind of spooky atmosphere to your talk today. So, but they are a little spooky, and some are a little dark, but they kind of get under our skin that way, and they make them memorable. So, do you believe that these ghosts are real?
I believe what people have told me, and most of the people that I've interviewed or that have come to me, because most of the people I have interviewed, they have sought me out. They have usually not been people who were interested in ghosts. And some were folks that actually had an aversion to ghosts, but they told me, this is what happened, this is what I saw.
Wow.
And that's what gives me the feeling that these are true and real.
Have you ever felt that you've seen a ghost or been in the presence of a spirit yourself?
I have seen things that I think were ghosts, but it was not anything like I was expecting to see. I've definitely felt the presence of one.
Interesting, yeah.
Would you like me to elaborate?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Well, the first time I felt in the presence of one was when I was researching my first ghost book, Ghosts of Georgetown, and my husband took me out to Hampton Plantation, which he was familiar with and I wasn't. And he said, if anybody has a ghost, these folks do. Well, at the time, I didn't realize the state was not wanting to go along with this, and the ranger out there told us there was not any ghosts there. But the house is awesome, so we paid and toured the house by ourselves. And upstairs was completely deconstructed. It didn't have any atmosphere that would. It was kind of like a barn upstairs, but you could tell where the bedrooms were and the rooms. Every room was when you stepped over a sill, and there was one I stepped over, and it was like walking into the most private place you could imagine. If there'd been a door, I would have felt like I needed to close it and give whatever was there some privacy. And coming downstairs, I thought, well, that can't be. So I went back up there, and it was exactly that way. And I found out much later that was the room where John Henry died.
Yeah. So that story has particular meaning to you.
Oh, indeed it does.
You believe that ghost story, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Were there any other times you felt that presence, some kind of otherworldly presence?
Indeed I have. But this particular time was more profound because I wasn't looking for it.
Yeah.
I'd been told there was no ghosts there.
Yeah.
And the more the most people that seem to have seen something, it's usually when they're not looking for it. Ghost hunters I've seen tend to, they're so eager, they don't, in my experience, usually see anything. Usually it's something that takes someone who's not ghost hunting completely by surprise.
Yeah. So it seems that in that way, ghosts kind of seek us out, not.
Maybe that is a good way to look. Maybe so.
What?
Indeed.
Why do you think that might be? Is there some? I mean, do you think is there a message maybe they're trying to get through to us, or what?
Possibly.
Is there? Why do you think? I guess in a larger sense, why do you think Georgetown County is so haunted? Why are there so many ghosts here? What might they be trying to tell us? Or
That is a very good question, Daniel. The theory that I've heard from a parapsychologist who's passed on now, she said that she believed that it was electric currents, or like that play like a film on the atmosphere, and our atmosphere is so damp and moist, and we're surrounded by water, and that is gives more reason for this to happen. Others feel like maybe they are earthbound spirits rather than energy. And there is one house in Georgetown where a lady has she has about 9 ghosts, and she had people come and bless her house, a Baptist minister actually, and sent one of these, just one, on to her parents because she apparently was not happy here. And this may have been this lady trying to give a message that she wanted to go.
Yeah, so it does, we are a very, Georgetown County, we're an old place, we have that deep history, which
indeed.
seems to be, you know, that typically in places that do have the, you know, a lot of hauntings, there is that depth of history and time, and there's a lot of, there can be sadness and a lot of traumatic events too, I guess, that you referenced as well that can bring it out, but not all the time. There are some I guess, happier stories, as you noted too. So.
And as you mentioned, dry, arid areas don't usually seem to have the ghostly activity of an old seaport like Charleston and Savannah.
Yeah, you don't
don't
think of too many Arizona ghosts, and the South seems to have more than its fair share of ghosts, I would say. And in South Carolina, Charleston, and right here in Georgetown, certainly we certainly donate our fair share, it seems like, of ghosts. So you're very busy. You're not going to run out of any stories to tell.
That is true. I've been told there are over 150 ghosts in Georgetown.
Wow.
I've not found that many yet, but I believe they're out there.
Okay, and so you gave us a great run through there, and that's just a nice connection with the history and all those different figures and the plantations, and but some famous figures, Theodosia Burr and Eliza Lucas Pinckney, and
Indeed.
so that it's. It connects up with a lot of what we want to do with this series, and it does it in such an interesting way. So I think folks are fascinated in, connecting history with Ghostlore. So thank you so much for being with us today, and we really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Yeah. And again, Elizabeth Huntinsger, and if you want to have some more of these ghosts, we have Ghost of Georgetown and More Ghost of Georgetown, and also Mysteries and Legends, where you expand out
Indeed.
to all her books. And she also, of course, runs the tour of Georgetown and Ghost. And we'll be back on Thursday, this Thursday, same place, same time, Digibridge lecture series, sponsored by SC Humanities with funding from NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities. Thank you so much for joining us. Please join us again.